There was a time when buying a video game meant buying a finished product. Maybe it had a few bugs here and there, maybe an expansion would come later, but when a game launched, players expected the core experience to actually be complete. The features were there, the systems worked, the content was ready. Developers knew they had one chance to make a strong first impression because once the game shipped, there was no guarantee they could completely rebuild it later. But somewhere along the way, that standard started changing. Now games launch missing features, suffering from performance problems, lacking content, or feeling barely finished. And instead of outrage, the response is often patience. Players say things like, just wait for the patches, give it a few months, or the developers will fix it later. I don't know about you guys, but that might be the strangest part about modern gaming. We've become so used to unfinished releases that disappointment itself started feeling normal. Early access games stay unfinished for years. Full releases feel more like paid beta tests, and roadmaps full of future fixes somehow generate excitement instead of concern. What used to be unacceptable slowly become expected. That being said, one question comes to mind. How the hell this happened? Because this isn't just a story about greedy companies or rushed development anymore. It's also a story about players lowering their standards little by little until incomplete games stopped feeling shocking at all. Early access wasn't originally a bad idea. In fact, when it first became popular, it actually made a lot of sense. Small indie developers didn't have massive publishers backing them up. They didn't have hundreds of employees or endless budgets. So early access became this arrangement between players and developers. Support us early, help shape the game, and together we'll build something great. At least that was the initial narrative. And honestly, sometimes it worked incredibly well. Games like Minecraft and Hades used early access properly. Players could see the progress, updates were meaningful, feedback mattered, and there was visible momentum. The problem is that over time, the meaning of early access started changing. What used to mean unfinished but promising, transparent development, and community collaboration slowly became incomplete products sold at full price, vague roadmaps, years of uncertainty, and an excuse for almost everything wrong with the game. Now you'll see games staying in early access for 3, 5, sometimes even 8 years, and at some point you have to ask, when does early access stop being development and start becoming permanent limbo? Because a lot of these games are no longer being treated like prototypes. They're being marketed like finished products. You have season passes, cosmetic shops, premium editions, influencer sponsorships, and huge launch campaigns. But the moment criticism appears, suddenly the defense becomes, well, it's early access. That's the shield. Performance issues, early access. Missing features, early access. Broken balance, early access. Half the mechanics unfinished, yes, you guessed it, early access. And because of that label, expectations immediately drop. What's strange is that players themselves started adapting to this mindset as well. People now buy games based on potential promises, roadmaps, future updates, stuff like that, instead of evaluating what's actually there right now. And that's a huge shift. Years ago, people judged games by the product they bought. Now, they judge games by the fantasy of what they might become someday. And sometimes that future never even arrives. Roadmaps quietly disappear. Updates slow down. Developers move on. The community shrinks and the game stays unfinished forever. But by then, the money's already been made. And my take on this is that this creates a dangerous industry precedent. Why finish a game before release at all, if players are willing to fund development indefinitely? And that's where the standard starts slipping, because the more consumers normalize unfinished products, the less pressure there is to actually ship complete ones. And to be clear, this doesn't mean all early access is bad. On the contrary, some developers genuinely use it responsibly. But the label itself has become so normalized that people barely question it anymore. It seems we reached a point where launching unfinished is no longer surprising. It's actually expected. The bigger change in modern gaming is that a full release no longer necessarily means a game is actually finished. Years ago, when a game launched, players expected the core experience to be complete, functional, and polished enough to stand on its own. Today, however, many games release with missing features, shallow systems, poor optimization, limited endgame content, or simply quality of life features that only arrive months later through patches and seasonal updates. What's even more surprising is how normal this has become. Instead of judging games based on the product that exists at launch, players are increasingly judging them based on what the game might become after updates, expansions, and future support. You can see this clearly in cases like Cyberpunk 2077, which launched with severe bugs, broken AI systems, and missing features despite years of ambitious marketing, only for the conversation to later shift towards how much better the game became after years of patches and the Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty expansion. The same pattern appears with Diablo 4, where many players enjoyed the early experience but later criticized the repetitive endgame, shallow itemization, and lack of long-term depth, while others insisted the game would improve in future seasons. Even games like Starfield showed how players now accept unfinished feeling systems as long as there's potential, with many people talking about mods and future updates almost immediately after the launch. Meanwhile, titles like Battlefield 2042 launched missing features that older entries in the franchise already had years earlier, including scoreboards, voice chat, and proper class systems, yet much of the discussion still focused on future improvements rather than questioning why the fuck those features were absent in the first place. These are only couple examples on top of my head, but that's the real shift that has happened in gaming culture. I suppose that the issue is no longer just that games improve after launch. That part is actually positive. The issue is that consumers have slowly accepted the idea that launches themselves no longer need to feel complete, polished, or fully realized, because there's now an expectation that patches, roadmaps, seasons, and expansions will eventually finish the product later. One way to explain why gaming standards have changed over time is psychological, because players themselves gradually adapted to disappointment instead of rejecting it. When people spend $70 on a game, buy deluxe editions, grind for hundreds of hours, or spend years hyping themselves up for a release, it becomes emotionally difficult to admit that the product may have serious flaws. This is where things like sunk cost fallacy and cognitive dissonance start playing a huge role in modern gaming culture. Instead of accepting that a game launched unfinished, shallow, or disappointing, many players subconsciously begin defending it because admitting the problems would also mean admitting they wasted time, money, or emotional investment. You can actually see this happening constantly online whenever criticism appears. Instead of discussing the flaws themselves, people immediately respond with things like, "You expect too much," or "It gets good after 40 hours," or "Mods will fix it," or, my favorite, "All games launch rough nowadays." Over time, people stopped comparing launches to what games should be, and instead started comparing them to other broken launches, which slowly lowered expectations across the industry. Brand loyalty and fanboyism made this even worse. Many people now build identities around franchises, publishers, or studios, so criticism of a game starts feeling personal, almost like someone attacking their favorite sports team. Discussions around games like Starfield or Diablo 4 often became less about whether the criticism was valid and more about defending the game's reputation at all costs. Social media amplified this behavior further because online communities reward hype, tribalism, and emotional reactions more than nuanced discussion. And as a result, criticism itself sometimes gets treated as toxicity rather than normal consumer feedback. The danger in all of this is normalization. You see, humans adapt quickly, and when enough games launch unfinished, missing features, or relying on future patches, people slowly stop seeing those things as unacceptable. Eventually, the mindset becomes, they'll fix it later. And once consumers normalize lower standards long enough, companies begin designing around these lowered expectations. To be fair, modern game development really is harder than it used to be. Games today are larger, more detailed, more cinematic, and significantly more complex than titles from 15 or 20 years ago. Developers now have to support massive open worlds, online infrastructure, cross-platform play, advanced graphics, live service systems, constant updates, accessibility features, and many other things. And communities around games expect non-stop content. The pressure is enormous, I get it, and there's no denying that creating modern AAA games is an incredibly difficult process. And honestly, some early access games have proven that this model can work when it's used responsibly. Games like Hades, Baldur's Gate 3, and Valheim show that involving the community during development can lead to genuinely fantastic results. But acknowledging all that still doesn't erase the larger issue. Yes, we can say that complexity explains certain problems, but it does not excuse regression. People aren't frustrated simply because games have bugs. They are frustrated because modern games sometimes launch missing features that existed perfectly fine in older titles years ago. Things like stable performance, meaningful progression systems, proper AI behavior, complete multiplayer features, or basic quality of life options are not revolutionary expectations. In some cases, newer games actually feel less complete than their predecessors despite having bigger budgets and longer development cycles. And that's where the conversation changes, because the issue isn't that the game development became more difficult. The issue is that consumers slowly became willing to accept less while paying more, as long as promises about future updates continue to exist. At the end of the day, the biggest reason these practices continue is because players keep proving that they work. Companies don't need to fully earn trust anymore when pre-orders alone can generate millions before anyone has even touched the final product. People buy deluxe editions months in advance, based entirely on trailers, cinematic reveals, and hype cycles, and then act surprised when the launch version feels unfinished. And when problems do appear, the conversation often shifts away from the actual flaws and towards defending the game instead. You constantly see players saying things like, just wait for patches, or the developers are listening, or it'll be good in the year or so, as if consumers are expected to pay now for the possibility of quality later. Even worse, criticism itself sometimes gets treated like negativity or hate, especially online, where communities form around defending franchises and studios almost unconditionally. Instead of asking whether complaints are valid, parts of the community immediately attack the people pointing them out. Someone criticizing performance issues, missing features, shallow mechanics, or aggressive monetization gets labeled impatient, toxic, or entitled. And the industry notices these behaviors. They're not stupid. If consumers continue buying unfinished products, continue pre-ordering regardless of track record, continue defending disappointing launches, and continue lowering expectations every single year, then companies have very little reason to change course. Businesses respond to what consumers tolerate, and modern gaming has showed again and again that players are willing to tolerate far more than they used to. And that's the uncomfortable reality behind all this. The industry didn't lower standards alone. Players helped normalize it, and as long as people keep accepting less, they'll keep getting less. It's as simple as that. For years, gamers loved to talk about how publishers changed, how corporations became greedier, how monetization got worse, or how modern releases started feeling less polished and less complete than they used to. And a lot of those criticisms are absolutely valid. The industry has changed dramatically, especially as budgets grew larger, live service models became dominant, and companies realized they could continue selling games long after launch through expansions, battle passes, cosmetic stores, and seasonal content. But at some point, the conversation has to become a little more uncomfortable, because the question is no longer just about what happened to games. It's also about what happened to us, the gamers. Somewhere along the way, gamers slowly stopped demanding complete products and started accepting promises instead. We began treating unfinished launches as normal, roadmaps as reinsurance, and future patches as substitutes for quality at release. Instead of rejecting broken systems, missing features, or shallow mechanics outright, many people adapted to them, defended them, or convinced themselves that things would improve later. Criticism became harder to have because online communities increasingly turned gaming into tribalism, where defending a franchise or studio mattered more than honestly discussing the state of the product itself. Players started buying games based on hype, nostalgia, trailers, brand loyalty, or future potential rather than what was actually being delivered at launch. And because consumers continued rewarding these practices financially, companies learned that they could get away with more. That's the real reason this conversation matters. The issue isn't simply that modern games launch unfinished or that standards feel lower than they once were. The issue is that consumers slowly adapted to these lower standards over time until disappointment itself became normalized. So in the end, maybe the biggest change in gaming wasn't tech, financial, or corporate at all. Maybe, just maybe, The biggest change was that players gradually stopped expecting better. But at the end of the day, that's just my take on this. Let me know in the comments what you think about this whole situation and whether or not I am right or wrong. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and all that good stuff. And that's it from me. Until the next one.